People think they taught me everything, but my dad taught me how to play the drums, and after that I taught myself. Wolfgang Van Halen, the son of rock star Eddie Van Halen, has shocked fans and people in the music business with his amazing change. After spending most of his career following in his famous father's footsteps, Wolfgang has now broken out on his own, showing not only his musical prowess but also an amazing personal transformation. Expectations were sky high when Wolfgang's quest began in the midst of a rock and roll dynasty. At first he became famous for his musical skills after performing with his famous father and uncle, but as he grew up it became clear that he was ready to go his own way. He has shown signs of a transformation in his life outside of music over the past few years. Losing weight and exercising more have both helped him change physically. We will look into Wolfgang Van Halen's amazing transformation and learn about the talented musician behind the famous name. A little boy named Wolfgang Van Halen was born in 1991 into a world of rock stars and TV stars. His father was Eddie Van Halen, the guitar prodigy whose groundbreaking techniques and scorching solos changed rock music, and his mother was the famous One Day at a Time singer. It's not easy to live in the shadow of a legend, no matter how famous that legend is. That was definitely the case for Wolfgang from the start of his amazing life. As a child, Wolfgang could hear music everywhere. It was in his house, in the air he breathed. His famous guitarist father Eddie was one of the all-time greats, and his lightning-fast fingers could make strange tones. Who could have grown up in such a place and not been affected by music? Almost everyone did. People expected Wolfgang to follow in his father's footsteps, but Wolfgang didn't want to just be like Eddie. He wanted to make his own name in the music business. Wolfgang showed signs of natural talent for this from a young age. The story is beautifully illustrated by a picture of a small child sitting at a drum set that is too big for him, his hands shaking as he tries to hold the drumsticks. Eddie's uncle Alex Van Halen, who was also in the band Van Halen, owned the Imagine a picture of a child already into rock and roll surrounded by the instruments that will become his tools in the future. It's almost too good to be true. Years later, Wolfgang posted this picture on Instagram with a caption that perfectly captured the moment, having a short jam session on Uncle Al's gear while rocking my drumming Uggs. From what he could remember, music had always been a part of his life, but his skill really took off when he got older. Now he has his own career as being the son of famous guitarist Eddie Van Halen. He took his drumming very seriously. By the time he was 9, what had started as light tapping on paper had turned into a strong, tangible rhythm. Wolfgang Van Halen's father sat down and taught him how to play the drums. Eddie Van Halen, seeing his son become a drum master, was very proud. Eddie could feel his excitement rising as Wolfgang played it perfectly. He was filled with joy over the fact that his son had carried on the family tradition of excellence. Even though Wolfgang grew up in a home where musical icons hung out and where inspiration was always in the air, his childhood was anything but carefree. His mother, Valerie Bertinelli, made sure that while they were in the middle of the extraordinary, she kept him grounded in the ordinary. When asked about his childhood, Wolfgang said he didn't know about his parents' fame. Like any other child's, it was full of love, laughter, and family memories, but it wasn't carefree. Wolfgang became the person he is today because of this delicate balance. Growing up with two famous people, one in rock and one in Hollywood, made sure he had a purpose in life beyond stardom. He was free to pursue his interests and find his path when he did. They encouraged him without forcing him to become a musician professionally. This shows how they raised him and the kind of person he has become: quiet, gifted, and driven not by stardom but by deep affection. Even though Wolfgang Van Halen grew up in a world where Eddie Van Halen was a rock star, he lived a quiet life. When asked by Guitar World if he thought of his dad as a rock god, he answered honestly and straightforwardly, "No, I don't really." The truth only became clear to him when he started to look through CDs and saw a lifelike portrait of his dad on the cover, a spiritual reminder of a life lived in the limelight. Wolfgang's true awakening happened when he was about 6 or 7 years old. Like all kids, he was hungry for knowledge, and one fateful day he found the key to unlocking his world. It happened while his father was remastering old albums with the band Wolfgang. He stumbled into a crate that contained those same records and looked over the credits. His eyes lit up when he saw his father's picture and his own name. His voice showed both his curiosity and his fear. He was excited as he asked his father to explain, but Eddie stopped when he realized it was his forte. He looked at his son and realized how serious the situation was, It only took one sentence to open the door to fame, music, and legacy. Eddie told Wolfgang about the family's history and the music that had an impact on their lives, including his father's accomplishments and the life they shared together filled with memories. Music was like finding a priceless gem. As Wolfgang got older, he started to get used to his new surroundings. His famous rock musician dad didn't change that he wanted to be his own man. There would be ups and downs, but he was ready for them all. As the drums beat and notes were played, he honored his dad while also shining in his own glory. The adventure had just begun, but Wolfgang was determined to follow in his dad's footsteps by making music that touched people all over the world. Wolfgang Van Halen's life was building up to a climax, and it looked like it would be just as dramatic and interesting as the ones that came before him. Wolfgang had a natural talent for music. As a child, he spent a lot of time playing the drums and getting lost in the beat. His famous guitarist father Eddie Van Halen was a rock legend in his own right, and teaching such a legend was the stuff of legends for many people. Wolfgang, on the other hand, found it a little more complicated. As he got older and into the rough years of puberty, he started to question everything. His desire to write music grew, and he wanted to be like his famous father. But he quickly learned that learning from a rock star wasn't easy. In a conversation with Louder Sound, he admitted that his father wasn't the best teacher. Whenever he asked Eddie for a lesson, Eddie would just smile and say, "Do that," referring to his own great playing, even though it wasn't really. While Wolfgang was still learning the basics of magic, Eddie would cynically respond with no problem at all, as if Eddie were encouraging him to do the trick. This made Wolfgang decide to do something about it himself. Instead of relying on his father's teachings, he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and start his own music career. In an interview with Spin, he talked about how he focused on honing his own sound and skills and was careful not to copy anyone else's, to sound like a fake cover of the late great Van Halen. Wolfgang learned most of what he knows on his own, but there was one time when he really stood out, when he decided he wanted to sing a certain song. He got this instrumental piece from his father for a moment event, a 6th grade talent show. Wolfgang wanted to perform the meaningful song, so he asked his father for help, and Eddie gladly offered. Eddie led Wolfgang through the song as the father and son sat. Unlike most teaching moments, this one was filled with love and friendship. Wolfgang picked up on the underlying emotions and melodies, and when he took the stage, he gave it his all. He felt proud, like he was letting the world in on a little secret from his father's heart. Even though Wolfgang wanted his own voice, Eddie wasn't there to see it. Even though he wasn't exactly a textbook teacher, the time they spent together musically was still instructive. Wolfgang's father seemed to follow him around whenever he picked up the guitar. Even as he made his own way in rock music, he paid tribute to the Van Halen name with every chord he played. Wolfgang will never forget that moment. It was a sobering reminder that no matter how far he went, he would never really be apart from his father's heritage, which was full of love, skill, and a special someone. Eddie Van Halen's son Wolfgang Van Halen had come a long way since then. By 2006, he had established himself as a talented musician. He was only 15, but his skills had already grown because his father saw his son's potential and took a risk that would change Wolfgang's life forever. He sent him an invitation to replace Michael Anthony on bass for the famous rock band Van Halen. Some people thought he was protecting his son's job by making this choice, but Eddie wasn't afraid to defend it. He said in an interview with Guitar World that he made it because of a story he told while drummer Alex Van Halen was listening closely. Eddie and Wolfgang were jamming together, completely focused on their music. Wolfgang was making the amazing bass lines, and Alex didn't know that his own nephew was making those sounds, and he was both amazed and scared to hear them with one key. Wolfgang was happy when Eddie finally asked him to join the band, even though he was jokingly against playing a bass solo. This was the start of a new chapter for the father and son. Wolfgang gladly accepted the offer, ready to dive headfirst into the rock and roll scene, even though he knew it would be hard. Questions still arose as they embarked on the 2007-2008 reunion tour with David Lee Roth, the band's original lead singer. Wolfgang's inclusion in the band raised eyebrows. Some fans saw him as a nepotism baby who was only allowed in because of his father's connections. They said hurtful things about him that hurt like hell looking back. Wolfgang did admit that it had been a very hard time at the time. He wasn't ready to deal with it, and the stress of it all finally got to him. It felt like the whole world was on his tiny shoulders and the negativity was crushing. But Wolfgang disproved their claims. He proved his worth to the legendary band Night. He was a part of the Van Halen heritage, and his talent and enthusiasm were clear every night when he took the stage with his uncle and father. He was also Eddie Van Halen's son Wolfgang Van Halen, and by 2013 he was already known as a talented musician. Before Wolfgang was born, Eddie Van Halen had formed the famous band Van Halen, and he had performed with them many times. He carried the weight of his family's musical heritage with him every time he took the stage. Music was his lifeblood. But in the same year he shocked the music business by announcing that he was joining a new band called Trussi. He was very excited about the job and gave an interview to Billboard in a way that was similar to how he did with Van Halen. He was taking this opportunity very seriously, even though his father's band had a long and storied history. Wolfgang was determined to make his own mark in the music business, even though his family's band was important to Wolfgang Van Halen. He was honest about how dedicated he was to his job in Tremonti, which he treated as seriously as any other band he was in, even when Van Halen wasn't performing. It was clear from what he said that he was dedicated to both groups. He was determined to become a successful artist on his own, not just following in his father's footsteps. In an interview, Van Halen talked about his unusual path to joining the hard rock band Tremonti. Rock Street Journal made it seem like it was meant to be. Wolfgang had known Creed's lead singer Mark Torti for a long time. They became closer through their shared love of music, but Wolfgang had no idea that their relationship would lead him on such an exciting journey. Everything changed one fateful night in New Jersey when he learned that Torti was in desperate need of a bass player. The band was just about to go on tour and the atmosphere was tense with worry and excitement. Wolfgang saw the chance and decided to leap in as his heart raced with adrenaline. He arrived at Tremonti's apartment at midnight, ready to take on the challenge. Time was running out and he had to memorize the whole repertoire in one sitting, no matter how hard it was. Wolfgang remained resolute, knowing that this could be a turning point in his career and a chance to step out from his father's shadow and take his place. Memories of that night are full of excitement. Wolfgang says he learned the whole set in one midnight session. He eagerly took on the task, his mind still racing with the excitement of that moment. The next day he went on tour with Tori Amos. In 2001, the world was shocked when famous guitarist Eddie Van Halen announced that he was fighting tongue cancer. His fans, including his family, went through a terrible time. The news cast a shadow over the rock and roll scene. No one could understand how this musical giant could deal with such a terrible illness. Eddie bravely fought his long battle with cancer, which ended in 2020 when he declared himself free of the disease. His fans felt a wave of relief, but the happiness didn't last because Eddie's cancer came back in 2020. It was a tragic turn of events and he lost his battle with the illness despite his best efforts. He was only 65 years old when he died. There was a lightning strike in rock music when Eddie Van Halen, Wolfgang's father, died. The relationship between Eddie Van Halen and Wolfgang had always been close, and he was deeply saddened by his father's death. As he carried the weight of his grief, the light in the world seemed to fade. Wolfgang talked about his feelings in an interview with Carson Daly today. He said that some days were easier than others and that grief was like a trip with no end. The struggle to accept and move on from the loss was ongoing, as Wolfgang admitted that the death of his father would be an ongoing source of pain for him. However, the pain became more manageable with each passing day and the journey itself became an accomplishment. Realizing that grieving was an ongoing process, he took on the difficulty of it with the goal of developing better ways to deal with it over time. Memories of his father were clear when he talked about how they helped him. To Eddie Van Halen's death was a huge loss for the rock music industry as a whole, but Wolfgang Van Halen felt an even deeper loss. Not only did he lose a famous father, but he also lost his dad, who was his best friend and biggest fan. With tears streaming down his face, he talked about how he was still his dad's most loving and closest friend. These words showed a deep sadness. Wolfgang's emotional statement to people about his father's soul continuing to affect him even after he died helped him get over his sadness and embrace life. Because of Eddie, Wolfgang was honest about the fact that he sometimes wanted to run away from life and go into the shadows, where the pain seemed to go away, but his father's memory jogged his limbs again. Keeping his father's memories alive gave Wolfgang a way to connect with his father. Gang's strength. The memory of Eddie's disappointment made him more determined to keep going. He wanted to hide from everyone and give up a lot, but he knew that his father would be very angry if he did. In his sadness, he felt the power of love and was driven to live a full life in honor of his father. During those dark days, Eddie's memory saved Wolfgang and kept them from certain doom. He remembered his father by living life to the fullest, making music and telling the world their story. Wolfgang Eddie wasn't just a memory for him, he was a lighthouse that inspired him to keep going, follow his heart and find happiness again. This kept the father-son relationship alive even after tragedy. Wolfgang Van Halen spent a lot of time in the recording studio when he wasn't on stage with Van Halen or Tori Amos. He worked hard on his debut album Mammoth, which is set to come out in 2021. The songs on this album weren't written in a vacuum, they were the Wolfgang played every instrument on the record, including the guitar, bass and drums. He made it clear that he wrote the song and played every instrument, which showed how dedicated he was to his art form and how he gave his creations a unique perspective. He also had artistic freedom. The album's success was entirely up to him, so he carried a heavy load. There was no one to split up the work, so if things went wrong it was all on him. He then said that while there's a lot more pressure, there's also a lot more creative freedom. He talked about the mix of excitement and anxiety he felt when he took full control of his music. It was his chance to shine, but he also had to prove himself. Wolfgang felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness as the release date drew neared. He realized that this record was about more than just the music. He used X, formerly Twitter, to think back on the album came out a year later. It was the result of years of work, failure, uncertainty and worry. He wrote, "The weight of his struggles was clear in these words, which showed how far he had come. He jumped headfirst into a new part of his life even though he wasn't sure if he was ready. Taking his music on tour was the next step in this new journey." Wolfgang put together a band of skilled musicians because he was excited to play his music live. He was very attached to the name Mammoth, so he chose it for the band. Wolfgang was the name of a three-piece band that his dad had led before he started Van Halen. Whenever he told the story, it made him nostalgic and he loved that name. It was his way of honoring his dad while also making his own musical identity. As a child, he had promised himself that as an adult he would forge his own path while staying true to his heritage by naming his album and band after himself. He was excited as he got ready to go on tour with Wolfgang Van Halen. Take center stage. Every show was a chance for him to meet his fans and play them the music he had put his whole heart and soul into. He was ready to face the unknown and any challenges that might come his way on the path that lay ahead. With every note he played, he honored his father's legacy and enjoyed his own artistic growth. He was ready to let his feelings and hopes flow onto the stage, which was his canvas. The sight of Wolfgang Van Halen and his fiancée Andrea Alsop making their big arrival at the 2022 Grammys was cause for celebration and hope. Their friendship had grown over the years of their long-term relationship. Their alleged journey began online when they first met. October 15, 2015, the date of their first date, would come to mean a lot to both of them in the years to come. They were finally ready to take the next big step, 8 years later. In a beautiful ceremony at their Los Angeles home, Wolfgang and Andrea exchanged vows on the